Welcome to the Resilient Earth podcast, where we talk with speakers from the United States and around the world about the critical issues facing our planet and the positive actions people are taking. From the tiniest of actions to the grandest of gestures, so that we can continue to thrive and survive for generations to come. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with co-hosts and co-producers Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study, located on the South Mendocino and North Sonoma coasts. The music for this podcast is by Eric Alleman, an international composer, pianist, and writer living in the Sea Ridge. Discover more of his music, animations, ballet, stage, and film work at ericalleman.com. You can find Resilient Earth on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, SoundCloud, and wherever you find your podcasts. This week on Resilient Earth Radio and Podcast, you'll be hearing a speaker from the 6th Annual Ocean Life Symposium that was broadcast on public radio and shown live on YouTube back in October of 2024. Seastorm Studios and Planet Centric Media teamed up again with Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study to produce this annual event about the health and future of our oceans and the marine life that lives within them. Today's speaker is Howie Garrett, president of the Orca Network, based on Whidbey Island in Puget Sound, Washington, near the Seattle Bay Area. And in this presentation, Howie raises the little-known concept of Orca Sociology. He starts by sharing a report from the Center for Whale Research. I'm Leanne Lindsay, the host, along with my co-hosts Scott and Tree Mercer, and that's coming up next, right here on Resilient Earth Radio and Podcast. Joining us now on the Ocean Life Symposium is Howie Garrett. He's the president of the board of directors for Orca Network, and their goal is to connect people with whales of the Pacific Northwest. And the Orca Network's Whale Sighting and Education Project encourages observation to increase awareness and knowledge about the southern resident community of orcas, JK and L pods, big transient orcas, and also other cetaceans, and to foster a stewardship ethic to motivate a diverse audience to take action to protect and restore their critical habitat. He began working as a field researcher with the Center for Whale Research on San Juan Island in 1981, and in 2001, he and his wife, Susan Berta, founded Orca Network, a nonprofit organization based on Whidbey Island dedicated to raising awareness of the whales of the Pacific Northwest and the importance of providing them healthy and safe habitats. And their projects include Whale Sighting Network, educational programs, presentations, events, advocacy, Langley Whale Center, Central Puget Sound Marine Mammal Stranding Network, and so much more. Welcome back, Howie. Good to have you with us.
Thank you, and good morning, Leanne and Scott and Tree. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Howie.
Yeah.
And we're going to now turn everything over to you and give you the next 50 minutes of presentation.
Well, okay. Thank you. I will introduce the concept of Orca Sociology, which nobody has ever heard of. So don't be surprised if you haven't heard of it. But I'd like to start out with a very intriguing incident, and I'm going to share a screen. This is from October 5th. This is a Center for Whale Research Encounter Reports, and if you haven't encountered their encounter reports, they're really fascinating. Some of the best photos you'll see anywhere, really intriguing photos. And this was an encounter like never before. This was when Mark Mallison was way out on the west side of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, actually on the western edge of Swiftsure Bank, basically out into the Pacific Ocean. And he was looking for L-pod, and especially for little L128, which was a calf that was born probably September 14th or 15th and was first seen on September 15th with mom L90 and looking good. But it was a kind of bizarre set of encounters over the next 3 days because it was just L90, who was first time mom, although 31 years old. And so very old to be a first time mom, probably had had some miscarriages or some babies that didn't make it and were never documented for that. Um, but looked okay along San Juan Island, just the two of them, the mom and the calf, up and down the island for several days. Very unusual without any other L-pod members anywhere nearby. So it's important to document the calf. And so he, on a flat Beaufort 0 day, went all the way out to the west side of Swiftsure Bank, and he did find them. So I want to read this because this is just objective documentation of what happened, the behavior of the whales. So initially, Mark assumed it was L90 with L128. But upon closer examination of his photos, he realized it was L83 with a small emaciated calf. L83 is another female, not directly related, not a sister, not in the same matriline with L90, who is the last survivor of her matriline, but another female, about 2 years older, so about 33, 34. And he realized it was L83 with a small emaciated calf. Just a couple of weeks earlier, CWR staff had photographed L90's newborn off the west side of San Juan Island, but this calf looked far from healthy. Rather, the calf appeared lumpy and skinny. Mark quickly sent pictures of the calf's right eye patch to Dave and Michael, and they eventually confirmed the troubling reality that yes, this was indeed the emaciated L128, just born like 3 weeks earlier. L90 was nearby foraging as L83 approached Mike 1, that's the name of the boat, with the emaciated calf draped across her rostrum. As she carried the calf down the side of the boat, Mark's heart sank. He was certain the calf had stopped breathing. L83 jiggled the calf as if desperately trying to revive it. As she continued past the stern of Mike 1, Mark thought he saw the calf take a faint breath and return to her side. Emotionally drained from the sighting, Mark decided at 13:23 it was time to end the encounter and make the 60 nautical mile journey back to Victoria Harbor. And I want to mention that Mark was who found J35, Tahlequah, when she had her calf that died within a half hour of birth in 2018. He saw that calf basically die before his eyes. And now here's another calf that was brought to him. So that's what I want to point out. What is going on here? L83, not the mother, another female, carries this calf over to Mark. I mean, that wasn't a random path. That was directly to Mark in his little open boat, right alongside the boat and around to the stern of the boat. So what was going on there? What I'm going to try to present to you is the idea that L83 was trying to say something, that there was a message in that. And that is based on my understanding of Orca sociology. So what is that? Where did that come from? And am I just trying to be a smartass? Did I come up with something, that sounds very intellectual, but has no actual basis? Well, let me try to describe this because I really came upon it honestly. And it goes back to 1963 when I graduated high school and enrolled at University of New Mexico. And I had no idea what I was going to do there. I didn't really have a major in mind. I didn't know what I wanted to be in life. I didn't know how to be an adult, really. So I would just take in courses, and one was a sociology course. And when it came time for the final, I passed in my final exam, and the after the grading, the professor came up to me in this 400-seat lecture hall and told me that I had gotten the best score in the class for anybody, which blew me away because I was never an A student. I have to admit, I wasn't all that highly motivated. Um, so that set my course right then. Okay, I am going to study sociology. I'm going to major in sociology because I can pass the courses. I can get through college if I major in sociology. So I did that. And 2 years later, I got an invitation from our other brother, Rick, in Berkeley, where he and Ken, my older brother, Ken Balcom, had an apartment saying, why don't you come on out? And that was 1965, which you may recall was the height of the free speech movement and all of the hubbub at Berkeley. And I was kind of interested in that. So it was a good move. I moved to Berkeley and enrolled at UC Berkeley. And my first class was with a man named Herbert Bloomer, who wrote the book literally called Symbolic Interactionism, which is a subdiscipline of sociology that was founded at the University of Chicago in the 1920s. And it was kind of an offshoot of sociology because it was sociology's answer to Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Because previously, sociology studied the structure and the functions of society, but Charles Darwin sort of put the science on the spot and said, well, how did it evolve out of nature? How did the human societies come to be, and how do they perpetuate themselves and maintain and to continue uh, to build institutions and traditions and everything we think of as society out of nature, out of our ancestors, our primate ancestors. How did that happen? And so this theory is called symbolic interactionism. And I was fascinated by it because what it helped explain to me is how the world works, which was such a huge mystery to me. I did not know uh, how to live in the world, how to adult, how to manage, how to get jobs, how to build relationships, how to succeed in life. And so I hope that this would give me some answers. And I think it sort of did. So I was just absolutely engrossed. Um, and I didn't actually get my degree until 1980. I traveled. I went on my own sabbatical, you could put it that way. Took some time off and dropped back into college when I was in Colorado Springs at Colorado College, which is kind of the Ivy League of the Rockies, kind of private liberal university, which had seminar type classes, which, meant very small, 15, 20 students. So a lot of time to dwell into a particular field. And of course, I dwelled into symbolic interactionism as sort of the way that that humans interact, using language, of course, but anything else that is meaningful gestures, anything from how you comb your hair, the clothes you wear, everything is symbolic and meaningful in some way or another, and it's all about interacting and building uh, institutions, and the whole structure of society evolves out of that. But it's a particular um, capacity that has to happen. And so I was just totally fascinated by that. And that year, not long after I graduated, Ken Balcom, my brother, came to Denver. He had been studying humpbacks, doing photo ID studies with humpbacks in the Caribbean and off Greenland, and he came through Denver. So and stopped off. His plane had to stop over, so we had lunch. And he said, "Why don't you come out to Friday Harbor?" Because he had started Orca Survey in 1976. So he was 4 years into the study at that point and needed some administrative help. And he asked me to volunteer. He could find me a place to sleep and feed me meals. And so I figured, well, that's the best offer I've gotten so far. So I'll take it. So I'll go out to Friday Harbor and study whales with him. And I really didn't have any background in whales up to then. I had visited Ken and I had seen orcas for that, but I didn't have any particular interest or knowledge about them at all. Um, so I was just this sort of blank slate as far as whale studies, but filled with these sociological theories and concepts and this way of seeing that I had what they called the sociological imagination. Um, of course, that was useless out there. Um, and my job was just to go out in the boats and take photographs with the long lens and get the photo ID shots for the catalogs. And that contributes to the demographic studies and builds a whole population structure analysis. So that was fascinating. But my first season was 1981. And I was there for 3 years and then went to New England. But in those 3 years, those were very, very energetic, very fertile years for knowledge, for understanding orcas, because the field studies begun by Mike Bigg in 1972, 73, who pioneered the whole photo identification method that has proven absolutely invaluable for not just whale studies, but every animal, every species on the planet can be studied by photo identification. But he pioneered it, and it became very enlightening, just incredibly useful for seeing the demographics, uh, the community structure, the lines, and several absolutely astounding findings were just coming into focus in the early 1980s, 80, 81, 82, such as that the offspring never leave their mother's side in southern residents. Of course, in other communities now, we know that there are exceptions to that rule. But for southern residents, the male and female offspring grew up, became adults, and stayed very close to their mothers. And so that was fascinating because that was unheard of. And John Ford had just published his studies on what he called dialects, which was that there are variations between the different pods, so that some pods have particular signature whistles that they use a lot. And so you can ID the pod by the acoustics, which was fascinating. But he also determined that the different communities, as the northern and the southern resident communities, which are very similar in many ways in their diets and in everything else about them, but are completely distinct and separate and do not interact and have completely different vocal vocabularies, that their acoustic communications uh, sound completely different. And in the early 80s, the first realizations began to dawn on the researchers that there were two completely distinct populations in the same habitat, sympatric populations of orcas that had nothing to do with each other. Residents and transients is what they were called. At first, for the first several years, they thought, well, the transients that they encountered must have been kicked out, must have been rogue whales that were not, somehow accepted. Maybe, males that lost the competitions or something, but that didn't fit what they saw. So, but they began to realize that no, these are a completely separate and distinct population. And they had seen enough to at least suspect that they had completely different diets, that the transients ate only mammals and that the residents ate only fish. They didn't phrase it that way. They said specialized or primarily only mammals and fish, effectively, but that's what they were beginning to see. So I'm there with this sociological imagination, and I'm seeing, well, okay, they're using some kind of vocal communication, and they are sorting themselves, or have in ancient history sorted themselves into separate cultures. These were cultures, uh, as I was understanding. And of course, that was totally, beyond the pale. Nobody was talking about cultures. It was completely, these were just animals, and you just study them objectively, study their population dynamics, their lifespan, their reproductive rates, their association patterns, their behavior, their diets. But nobody was talking about culture. So at this point, what I would like to do is share screen again, but this time go to my presentation. Let's see, okay. And hit that.
And you're listening to
And
the voice of Howie Garrett, who's the president of the board of directors for Orca Network. And now we do see your presentation, Howie.
okay, that's great. All right, so this actually was given several years ago, and it was about Toki, Lolita, in Miami at the time. So I started with the captive orca and her natural history. And what I tried to introduce, this a presentation in 2016 in Friday Harbor. So I was introducing the sociology of orcas. And I want to say here, just in case there's any concerns, that this does not replace the demographic studies, everything that is still ongoing in terms of population studies, the dynamics, Josh's presentation. This is all important information that is the context. This is the foundation for what I'm going to try to introduce, which is a new paradigm, but it's built on the decades of research that has been done, the population studies that we have already established and documented. And to talk about the sociology of orcas is kind of a taboo. And part of the science of sociology is taboos. What are taboos? Every culture has them, many of them. So that will come into play here. But as I was saying, nobody talked about culture in whales and dolphins in the 1980s or 90s until 2001. And that was when Luke Rendell and Hal Whitehead wrote and published this paper in the very prestigious Journal of Behavioral and Brain Sciences called Culture in Whales and Dolphins. And what they said right there in the abstract is, the complex and stable and behavioral cultures of sympatric groups of killer whales or Sinus orca appear to have no parallel outside humans and represent an independent evolution of cultural faculties. And that gave me a big sigh of relief, because that was basically what I had been holding inside, thinking and reality checking for almost 20 years at that point, that yes, they do live as members of cultures. They do live in learned cultures that they learn from their ancestors and from their families and from other members of their cultures. But one thing that Rendell and Whitehead make clear is that they did not want to talk about language. They say that yes, language is essential for human cultures, but there is no data and no basis for speculating on whether or not orcas use language. So they punted completely on that issue. So what they did was establish the objective facts, the field reality that orcas are found in cultures. So that was a big start. But it didn't seem to really trigger any deeper look into what makes a culture. How do cultures evolve, and what are they? What keeps them together? What maintains cultures? Let's see. I've got the top of this is there's a banner there. You know, there's a way to get rid of that, I think. Well, let's see. Okay. But anyway, there were other studies that sort of ventured into talking about culture. Cultural identity is important in this species in both the North Atlantic and the Pacific. That was a study from 2016. And the sperm whale study shows that sperm whales form clans with diverse cultures and languages. So at least in sort of the popular media, there is some discussion of whale cultures, including the idea of languages. So the question presented to the cetological community was, how did this happen? How did orca cultures develop? It was and still is a very big question. The whole issue of speciation. Should there be separate species? And there was a big debate and a proposal to designate residents and transients as separate species, give them new Latin names. And that was by a whisker that was declined at the Society for Marine Mammalogy. But it sort of left the issue open. But at least there is this understanding that culture can guide evolution, that the evolution of the species of the different communities of orcas are determined, or at least in to a great extent, affected by the culture, the cultural rules, the taboos for mating in particular, that it's internal mating practices, so that residents don't mate with transients or with northern residents or with any other community. All maintain their insulation and cohesion, and those are rules, and those over time, over thousands of generations, affect the evolution of each of those species, of those communities, I should say, although are they species or not? That's still an open question. So we have slight morphological differences, the pigmentation, the shapes of different whales, the sizes are different in different communities. So that was in the literature. Orcas are the first non-humans whose evolution is driven by culture. This is 2016. This is becoming apparent. So my problem is that I have this background in sociology, but I'm now immersed in cetology, and there is a big gap in between. And sociologists don't talk to cetologists or vice versa. They just they speak different languages and don't associate at all. They're like residents and transients. So what I want to do is leap across that gap and see how sociology can help inform cetology and vice versa. So this question is, how did these intact, cohesive communities of orcas develop? Because that's not found anywhere else in nature. You won't find two populations of black bears on the same mountain that are completely separate and distinct and have different diets and never interbreed. It's just not found in wildlife biology anywhere else. Other species of whales, toothed whales at least, may have this, but it's just not found anywhere else in nature. So what's the explanation? So here was a paper that argued that they are undergoing ecological speciation as a result of dietary specializations. In other words, first came the dietary specializations, and that separated different communities. And so then they just maintained those separations um, as cultures. Okay, that's one theory, dietary specializations. Another theory that came out in 2015, our data suggests that glacial cycles influenced local populations and have played a major role in geographic radiations, diversification, and speciation. So maybe they got separated by glaciers or glacial cycles, and then the glaciers thawed, but those separations continued for some reason, though that's not well explained. Just an attempt to explain the origins here. Um, so it seems like there is this grasping for a cause, a original cause for the separation into the different communities of orcas that we see that are very well established and documented around the world. And here is this great graphic by Uko Gorder that's now about 10 years old, but that goes into the Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, and the main communities of orcas that were known at that time. There's a few more known now. I was excited to hear a couple of weeks ago of the discovery, actually from photos that go back almost 20 years, but the scientific description that Ingrid Visser wrote up of a population of orcas in Fiji or around the Fiji Islands. And one unique characteristic there is that some of them have no saddle patch at all. There are a lot of variations in saddle patch, as we can see, but this was the first community I've heard of that had no saddle patch. So they're still being discovered. Different communities of orcas around the world. They inhabit every ocean in the world, but they have not all been described for science. And about 10 years ago, this issue of the ACS newsletter, The Killer Whale, the top predator, edited by Robert Pittman, really went a long way toward describing the different communities and sort of the whole phenomenon of what are killer whale, what is the radiation of killer whale communities, cultures around the world. And he says in this issue that the term ecotype then merely recognizes scientific uncertainty with regard to killer whale diversity. And until we know more about killer whale speciation, was it dietary specializations or was it glaciation? You know, what separated the communities originally? The term ecotype will remain a placeholder or a work in progress. So it's a word that describes the different communities, but it doesn't really describe them. It just names them. It's just a label for them. And here, of course, this is the well-known distinction between big killer whales and residents, their diets, their vocalizations, their sizes, no dispersal from either, and no recruitment. They don't compete for food, but the result is sympatric speciation in the same habitat, crossing paths all the time, very well aware of each other, but no interaction, no association at all. And of course, this is a really burning question in cetology, understanding orca culture. This was by Lisa Stifler, 2011. Scientists have found increasing evidence that culture shapes what orcas and how orcas eat, what they do for fun, even their choice of mates. So that's established. They live in these complex, learned cultures. And how how does that happen? Well, we can look at maybe some of the behaviors, some of these social behaviors. And this is about as good a photo as you can get of a ceremony. Orcas have rituals, they have ceremony. And one is a greeting ceremony when pods meet up. Sometimes, I mean, I've seen it a few times back in the 90s, but uh, it's pretty rare, pretty hard to see. Maybe it happens out in the Pacific, out of sight now, where they are more often now. But they line up in their pod formation, K pod, L pod, J pod, in separate lines, facing each other for several minutes. And then those lines dissolve and they meet in the middle, but not all in one group, in a whole lot of separate groups, each having, from what I witnessed, 15 to 20 or so individuals that are rolling around, a lot of, kinetic, touchy-feely contact, and it's mostly underwater, and it's very loud. If you listen with the hydrophones, it's the loudest cocktail party you've ever been to. And eventually they have to come up and breathe. And then they disperse and meet up into different groupings with a different set of individuals, always a mixture of the different pods, though. And then having this sort of ceremonial, whatever they're doing, very, close contact behavior underwater. And then you eventually rise up and go off and form into new and different groups. And this is how it looks when they come up for air. I don't recommend this boat behavior, but this was what was seen much more commonly in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, and very rarely today, this kind of very close association behavior. Does happen, but it's rare. So back to this study from Luke Rendell and Hal Whitehead in 2001. And this was what I mentioned before. Human culture is intimately linked to both language and symbolism, but there is currently no empirical basis for discussing the role or non-role of language and symbolism in cetacean culture. Well, I would like to discuss the role of language and symbolism in cetacean culture. And that depends on the concepts that I learned in sociology applied to study of orcas, because, of course, human culture and sociology are very much dependent, completely, intertwined with the idea of language and symbolism as being the guiding forces that create cultures. And this was my teacher. This was Herbert Bloomer. He wrote the book on it, like I said, and these were his sort of basic principles of what is symbolic interactionism. How do humans interact? And of course, the whole field of sociology would never allow that any other animal on the planet could possibly be practicing symbolic interactionism. This was all totally about humans. We act toward things on the basis of the meanings that things have for us. These meanings become modified through an interpretive process. The meanings of such things derive from the social interactions one has with others. And Bloomer contrasted this process with behaviorist explanations of human behavior. We could substitute orca behavior, which does not allow for interpretation between stimulus and response. When orcas are interacting, in other words, if we apply these concepts, They are communicating meanings to each other, and those meanings are interpreted by each member, each listener, each receiver of the communication. And Boomer said symbolic interaction is possible for humans because we have highly developed brains, we rely heavily on society, and we are able to make many subtle and sophisticated sounds. Well, check. Big brains, orca brains are 5 times size of human brains. They rely heavily on society. They are probably the most social mammal known to science. And orcas are certainly able to make many subtle and sophisticated sounds. Those are the prerequisites. Those are required for any animal to be able to use symbolic interaction to build cultures, to build associations, patterns, institutions, ceremonies, behavior. And orcas have all that. They certainly can do it. And the guiding ethic seems to be we are strongest when we are together. So there's a lot more that can be said about that. And we're up to about 15 minutes before the next presentation, maybe some time for Q&A. But what I want to say is that behavior with Mark out west on Swift Shore Bank when L83 brought a little emaciated L128 at about 3 weeks old, but either dead or dying. Was she intending to tell him something? Was there a message? Was that a meaningful communication to him, an attempt at a meaningful communication? But of course, it depends on interpretation. It depends on the reception and the understanding of what it is. Mark describes it objectively, but went away pretty shook up from that experience and is probably still processing what happened. But yes, it's an anecdote, but it's also, it fits a pattern. When there's enough anecdotes, they become data. And what happened in 2018 when J35 Tahlequah's calf died right in front of Mark's eyes again, but she carried that calf around for 17 days in a very populated area with a lot of boats around, a lot of cameras, and we don't know how much they know about what our behavior means, what we're doing, but they certainly knew, she knew that they were being seen. And Ken called it a tour of grief. And it just seemed to be trying to say something. And of course, we know Ken had studied, has established since, since the population declined between 1995 and 2001 of about 20% that triggered the endangered species listing, that the primary overriding problem is lack of sufficient Chinook salmon, that they have specialized for thousands of years on Chinook salmon that have been abundant in these waters year-round for thousands of years. But now, due to multiple habitat degradations, the damming of rivers, overharvesting, that there are just very few Chinook. Many populations are completely extinct and many are endangered. So there's just a small percentage, a single-digit percentage of the former numbers of Chinook salmon They can eat other species, but they don't have the caloric value. They don't have the nutrition. And of course, a pregnant female carrying a young and then lactating to nurse that young needs twice as much as all the rest. And so that's when they are most vulnerable. And that is what is limiting the population of the southern residents now is reproductive failure, is basically miscarriages and infant mortality. So um, that seemed to be the message. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that they know what's happening. They know what's happened to their families. They're down to 73 now, which was where they were when the studies began, basically in 1976. They were at about 70 or 71. And they went up in the mid 1990s to almost 100, 98, 99, and then dropped off to 2001, where they were back to 73, and that's where they are now. So they know what's happening, and I'm sure they associate human activity, what's happening, and they know Mark. Mark has been out there with them for over 20 years. They know him, they know his boat. I think he was trying to ask him to tell us to do something or stop doing whatever it is that is decimating the salmon population.
Thank you for raising all of that awareness for us, Howie. That is critical information, observation that you and others are doing, not only with the Orca Network. And this is Howie Garrett. He's the president of the board of directors for the Orca Network in Washington State. And he has been talking with us for this past hour about all these critical, complex social issues that impact the orcas and other ocean life that lives in our seas. And bringing this awareness to our audience is so important. And this is why we are doing this annual symposium every year, is to bring voices like yours out here on YouTube, on radio. We're independent public radio station, a small one in Northern California on the South Mendocino coast and Northern Sonoma coast. This is KGUA 88.3 FM. I'm Leanne Lindsay, a filmmaker and audio producer, and also along with experts of whales as well, with the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study, Scott and Tree Mercer, who are with us today. They have an extensive background that I'll go into, but before I do that, I want to bring them to the stage here and get you guys to talk with Howie about all the critical things that he was just sharing with us.
Yeah, Howie, in my way of thinking, there is no question that these animals, these highly intelligent social animals, are definitely communicating an important message to us. To me, the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to listen to this? Or are we going to ignore it and just carry on with the way we're doing things now and put them at further risk? That is my hope, is that enough of us will listen to them and take action. But my question, Howie, is I may have missed this. I apologize if I do, but L90 was the mom of L128, the calf. And L83, I was wondering, is there a relationship between L90 and L83?
It's not a direct matriline relationship. They're not sisters. L90 has no more members of her matriline at all remaining. So her mother, her siblings all have died. So, we don't know how they define their relationship. But certainly, they have been together in the same community, the same pod of L pod for, ever. And so they're all one big extended family. So maybe a distant cousin, I mean, however we may describe that. But uh, they're they're just an intertwined family that they know each other more intimately than we ever could. So yes, she's family. I just don't know the exact relationship.
I understand that. That is very fascinating and also, quite sad what has happened. And we are quite certain that this is due to the inability of L90, the mother, to successfully nurse the calf because she herself is probably not as well nourished as she needed to be to raise this calf properly.
Correct. Yes. There is likely this complication of the compounding effect of the toxins, the organochlorine, PCB, PBDE, hormone disrupting or blocking pollutants that are in the water, in the ecosystem, were dumped in when they were banned on land. The barrels of this toxin were dumped into the water as if, okay, we'll just flush that toilet and it's gone. But no, it filtered out into every living thing. They're molecule by molecule are lipophilic, which means they attach to fat cells. And of course, whales have huge amounts of fat cells, their whole blubber layers. So in normally they sequester into the fat levels, layers, but when hunger sets in, when there is lack of nutrition, those fat cells are drawn into the bloodstream for energy,
Mhm.
and that releases all of these pollutants that then flood the system and block the hormonal action in the development of the calf in particular, but even in adults that are hungry. So it's a compounded effect, but the test case is the transient big killer whales, which are even more heavily loaded with the pollutants because they eat higher on the food chain. They eat seals that are already heavily loaded with these pollutants. So they have heavier loads, and yet they are thriving. They are reproducing and increasing at a rate of 4 or 5% a year. They're doing incredibly well. And they have all the same issues with sound, and everything else. The difference is they have a lot of food because
Mhm.
there's plenty of seals and sea lions and porpoises. And so they've got lots to eat. And so they do not draw down their fat supplies for energy. They've got plenty of fresh food all the time. So that's the test case that shows the difference is in the food supply.
And
Ah,
I want to address that in the last minute or so here that we've got. Howie, you mentioned before about the salmon being a big part of their diet, and now with the dams that are being removed from some of the rivers, is that going to help increase the salmon population for these whales so that they do get more nourishment? And then I want you to kind of give a quick summary as we move into the 11 o'clock hour on the Ocean Life Symposium.
Right. Well, thank you for bringing that up, Leanne, because that is a very, very important point. And the Elwha dams were brought down. I did a presentation here on that. And that has already produced results of more Chinook and steelhead, which orcas also eat. And now the Klamath dams are down. So we'll start to see those results. In fact, already a salmon has gone up past the former dam site. So that is already showing results, and that is going to increase the overall salmon for the orcas. But yet remaining, the big low-hanging fruit are the four Snake River dams. They really need to be removed, and that's a huge issue. But and we don't have time for it now. But those four dams need to be removed. There's or breached, and it's really not a big process. But there's 5,000 square miles of pristine salmon spawning habitat above those dams, but the smolts, after a year or so of growth at 6 or 8 inches, can't make it to the ocean because it's 140 miles of slack water, those dams. So
And Howie, you mentioned a documentary. Just real quick, if you can give the title of that, and it'll be coming out as soon as it gets distribution.
there is a documentary coming out soon. I hope. We don't know exactly the distribution yet, but it's called The Snake and the Whale. And it goes into all these issues that we've been talking about.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Howie Garrett, President of the Board of Directors of Orca Network, for joining us today on the Ocean Life Symposium, along with Scott and Tree Mercer of the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study. We appreciate you being here with us today on public radio and on YouTube.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. Our best to Susan.
All right.
Yes, your wife, Susan Berta. Bye, Howie. Thanks for listening to the Resilient Earth podcast, where we talk about critical issues and positive actions for our planet. Resilient Earth is produced by Planet Centric Media, a 501c3 nonprofit, and Seastorm Studios, Inc., located on the rugged North Sonoma coast of Northern California. I'm Leanne Lindsay, producer and host, along with co-hosts and co-producers Scott and Tree Mercer of Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study, located on the South Mendocino and North Sonoma coasts. The music for this podcast is by Eric Alleman, an international composer, pianist, and writer living in the Sea Ridge. Discover more of his music, animations, ballet, stage, and film work at ericalleman.com. You can find Resilient Earth on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, SoundCloud, and wherever you find your podcasts. Please support us by subscribing or donating to our cause.